My mother evicted me from the house my father bequeathed to me. After my father's death, he left me a house in his will. However, my mother kicked me out so I could live there with her new family. 15 years later, I tried to reclaim my home, but they began threatening me, so I turned to the police. I am 24 years old. I'll start by explaining that my mother evicted me from the house to impress her new husband. If the word kicked out sounds too harsh, let's say she forced me to leave my home and made me live with my paternal grandparents. All my good memories are tied to the time when my father was alive. Unfortunately, he died when I was only 7, leaving me feeling devastated. I was very close to my father, and saying goodbye to him in the coffin broke my heart. I still clearly remember that moment, and it still hurts me as I try to cope with the loss. While I was dealing with the grief, my mother brought in another man and insisted that I call him Dad. I thought to myself, no way, unsure if I was right or wrong, but it just didn't feel right to call him Dad. A few months after my father's death, following our first meeting, I often saw this man in my mother's bedroom, and it was hard for me to watch how quickly she moved on. She didn't even wait a year to bring someone into our home to replace my father. I wasn't ready to accept this man. I was only 8 years old when they had their beautiful wedding. They organized quite a large event, considering both were marrying for the second time, but it wasn't my concern. She left me with my grandparents and went on her honeymoon. A month passed, but she never returned. I kept asking my grandparents when my mother would come for me, but they had no answers. Then one day, she appeared. I was so happy to see my mother after a long time that I rushed to hug her, but she brought all my belongings. It was, to say the least, heartbreaking. I lived with my grandparents until high school and was happy with them. My mother occasionally visited me just to say how much she loved and cared for me. Sometimes I asked her, "If you love me so much, why did you leave me with my grandparents?" She had no answer. She tried to justify herself by saying, "Your grandparents are aging. They need help with groceries and the trash." Later, she confessed the real reason. She gave my room to her stepson, killed her new husband, and had 2 children who moved into our home after their wedding. My mother prioritized her new family over me, and naturally, I felt hurt by her. Over time, I stopped trying to maintain contact with her. After finishing school, I moved out of my grandparents' house, but continued to visit them often. They were my saviors. They raised me. If it weren't for them, my childhood would have been completely destroyed. Now, at 24, after a year of working in marketing, I decided to start my own business. For this, I needed startup capital, so I decided to rent out my house. Oh, and if I haven't mentioned it before, here's an unpleasant surprise for my mother and her new family. The house they live in belongs to me. Yes, it's true. My father meticulously drafted his will before his death, leaving all his property, including the house, to me. I was a child when his lawyer read the will at the funeral, but judging by my mother's expression, it was clear she didn't like it at all. Later, I learned that she tried to contest the will several times but failed each time. My father had crafted the will very carefully. The house was meant to go to me, but I could only sell it after reaching the age of 22. Before that, no one else could claim ownership. My grandparents believe that my father likely foresaw my mother's plans, which is why he made the will so strict. Otherwise, she might have manipulated me during my childhood to give the house to her. Last month, I called my mother to inform her of my plan to rent out the house, but she didn't answer my calls. This week, when I went to visit my grandparents, I told them I was planning to earn some money through the house. They reacted strangely. I asked, "What's wrong?" And they said that I might face serious resistance in vacating the house because my stepsister, Brenda, is pregnant by a guy who fled his responsibilities. Additionally, she lost her steady job and is now working the evening shift at a store. Essentially, they are in a difficult financial situation. Now, I really don't know what to do. I need this house too. I quit my job and need startup capital to start my business. Update 1. The situation has become quite dramatic. As I mentioned earlier, my grandparents told me that my mother and her family are going through tough times right now, so they might not want to vacate my house. I decided to inform my mother of my plans and give them a few months to move out. Previously, I thought of sending a 1-month notice, but considering their situation, I decided to allow 3 to 4 months. Since my mother wasn't answering my calls, I went to her home. The house was no longer what I remembered, and my mother had changed. She exuded coldness. Maybe she had already guessed why I came. Upon seeing me at the door, she forced a fake smile and reluctantly hugged me. Note that we hadn't seen each other for almost a decade. Yes, she stopped visiting me when I became a teenager. I held a grudge against her, and how could I not? Despite not seeing each other for so many years, she didn't even ask how I was doing. I didn't interest her at all. It seemed her attitude was reflected in phrases like, "Oh, so it's you. Something important brought you to my door?" I replied, "Oh no, nothing important. I just stopped by to check how you're doing after all this time." She smiled and said, "Yes, indeed, it's been a while." After that, a 5-minute pause ensued while I got up to leave. It was extremely unpleasant. I didn't feel like a welcome guest at all. Besides my mother, there was my pregnant stepsister, Brenda, who also looked at me as if I had come to cause trouble. At that moment, I abandoned the idea of reclaiming the house. I began looking for other ways to find money for my business, but my mother crossed all boundaries of her narcissism. Last week marked the 15th anniversary of my father's death. My grandparents held a small prayer ceremony at the church. Since I was in town, I decided to organize a proper ceremony to honor my father, feed the poor, and give gifts to children from underprivileged families. I invited friends and relatives to the prayer and also sent my mother an email invitation, but she didn't respond. When I checked the sent history, I saw that she hadn't even opened the email. It was my first letter to her. I thought maybe it went to spam or something similar, so I went to her house again. This time, my mother wasn't home. The door was opened by my stepsister, Brenda. No greetings, no pleasantries, just a confrontational question. "You're here again? What do you want?" I replied that I had come to meet my mother. She said, after her last conversation with me, "Do you really think she wants to see you again?" She spoke so harshly that I didn't immediately grasp her words. Then I stammered, "I came to invite my mother to the prayer ceremony in honor of my father." She laughed in my face and said, "That was 100 years ago. Forget it already." I responded, "Sorry, that's my father, and it's none of your business to comment." She rolled her eyes and went back to her room. I sat on the porch feeling like an idiot for a couple more minutes before leaving a note for my mother on the table, asking her to call me back. She called the next day, and I told her about the prayer ceremony. She paused for a minute, and then said she couldn't come because she had to take Brenda for a medical examination. I was disappointed. She could have at least said she would try to come, but outright refusing was hurtful. I replied sarcastically, "Well, of course, they're your priority. We're nobody to you, so let it be. Good luck raising that narcissistic girl and her baby." My mother exploded. I said, "Why should I be nice to her if she was so mean to me? She mocked my father's death and Brenda's protection." My mother responded, "Of course she's angry. You can't talk about the dead around a pregnant woman. You're as insensitive as your father." At that moment, I lost my temper. I yelled at her not to dare speak ill of my father. "If anyone here is insensitive, it's you, talking about my deceased father in such a tone?" She retorted. "Your father died 15 years ago. Damn it, deal with it," I said. "Of course, like you in a couple of weeks, or maybe days. Who knows? You know what? You don't need to come. My father wouldn't want your prayers." Seeing your true face, I left the call that same day. I hired a lawyer and began the process of sending an official eviction notice. It took my lawyer about 15 days to confirm my father's will and send the notice to my mother. As expected, when the eviction notice reached them, she was furious. Clearly, she never thought I would take such measures to get revenge for not attending the prayer. In memory of my father, I laughed upon hearing her voice message and blocked her. When she couldn't reach me, she showed up at my grandparents' house. I wasn't there at the moment. Yes, I'm back living with my grandparents while I sort out my life. My mother asked them to convince me to withdraw the eviction notice. My grandparents are kind and gentle people, so they didn't evict her. They said they couldn't influence the situation. They own the house, and I can do whatever I want with it. Of course, this response didn't sit well with my mother, and she blamed my grandparents for raising me as a spoiled brat. Seriously, I asked my grandmother why she didn't say anything to me. "Narcissistic," I told her. "I want to get in touch. And now, I won't let them live in my house any longer." The next day, I sent the eviction notice in accordance with our country's tenant laws. Although they aren't tenants and don't pay me any rent, I'm the one who pays the property taxes annually. Legally, I have the right to evict them at any time, even right now. My grandparents are religious people, so they discouraged me from this idea. They said, "In the name of the Lord, give them at least this month to find another place to live. Brenda is a pregnant woman, and we shouldn't kick her out onto the street." I sighed and said, "She doesn't need any help. She's as toxic as my mother." My grandparents responded, "Let it be. Maybe she's a sinner, but her unborn child is innocent. Don't be cruel to that little being." They convinced me to wait, even though I was set on evicting them that same day. The next day, my mother called me. I ignored her because she did the same thing when I called her. She sent a message saying we urgently needed to talk. I replied, asking her to check my schedule and meet me at my grandparents' house during my free time. She clearly didn't like that, so she sent a long message accusing me of trying to pressure her. What did I do? Nothing. I didn't respond. Maybe she understood the hint that I wasn't going to give in to her pressure. Throughout my childhood, whenever I cried or had tantrums because I wanted to go home, instead of showing me love, she scolded me and demanded that I behave properly. She instilled fear in me to become a good boy and not cause scenes. That was her parenting style, and it worked to please her and avoid conflicts. I stopped crying, but after she left, I spent hours sulking at home. Now it's different. Now, sulking is her problem, but unfortunately, she won't even have her mother at home. My mother came to me willingly, and I made her wait an hour on purpose. She started getting nervous. I asked my grandparents not to interfere. She kept asking them about me, but they replied that they didn't know where I was and immediately retreated to their room. When I finally appeared, my mother looked at me with obvious irritation, as if to say, "Where have you been? I've been waiting for you for an hour." But she didn't say anything. She sat with a stone face. People in her position would have tried to appease me, but she firmly stood her ground. She said, "All right, I'll start. I can't sit here forever. I have things to do." I mumbled to myself. Of course, searching for a place to live is a complicated task. She looked at me annoyed and asked, "What is this notice?" I replied, "It's written in English. I'm sure you can read it, or do you want me to do it for you?" This infuriated her. She threw the notice in my face and declared that she wasn't going to leave the house because of some stupid notice. After she finished yelling, I said, "Well, then let's wait and see what the consequences will be for not complying with the court order." She responded, "I gave birth to you. Don't you dare try to be smarter than me. This house belongs to my husband, and no one can evict us from here." I said, "But the legitimate heir can." I calmly replied to her to further anger her, and it worked. At that moment, when she called my father her husband, I lost my patience. "Seriously, do you have the nerve to call your father your husband when you skip the prayer for him, saying he's in the past? You don't deserve his house. You're just invaders, and I'll free this house from all leeches." She stood up and declared that she had been kind to me. "Now I'll have to deal with your lawyer." I laughed and said, "Of course, please, you have another 20 days. Let's see what you do." Update 2. After much effort, I finally got the house. As I mentioned earlier, I sent my mother and her family a 30-day eviction notice. She came to me and tried to turn everything upside down using manipulation, but I stopped her, and she left. The following events were pure manifestations of their narcissism. You can imagine her stepsister, Brenda, pounced on me and even threatened to file a harassment claim against me. She played the victim card, saying things like, "I can do whatever I want because I'm carrying a child." I said, "Woman, pregnancy won't save you from troubles." She even tried to pressure my grandparents while we showed her the cameras installed around the house. I said, "If you come here again, I'll ensure your arrest." After that, my mother appeared to protect her golden stepsister. She accused me of insulting and morally tormenting her pregnant Brenda. She declared that she was going to sue me. I said, "Great, let the judge decide based on the video footage." When she realized she couldn't achieve anything by force, she softened, started crying, and said that I did something wrong in her upbringing, making me such a selfish person. She even dragged my deceased father into the conversation, saying that it was his fault he died so young and didn't give me proper upbringing. I responded, "Wait, if anyone needs to be blamed, it's only you, not for bad upbringing. You never raised me. My grandparents did, and they did an excellent job. You should apologize for leaving me, but you know what? I'm even glad you didn't raise me, seeing how you raised your stepsister. I understand I've avoided the worst." I said, "I don't want any more conversations. I just want to reclaim my property. I've allowed them to live here for free for many years. Now, I really need it." I tried to explain my situation to her, saying I quit my job and need money to start my business, so I plan to rent out the house. She went berserk, saying I'm evicting them just to let strangers into the house. I said, "Strangers will pay me rent. If you're willing to pay, you can stay." She became even angrier, accusing me of meddling. "There's no family here. You threw me out like trash and almost didn't care about me, my birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving. You never came, and even when you did, you made me feel like you were doing me a favor. What kind of mother does that?" My mother, as expected, had tried every method of manipulation, gaslighting, inducing guilt, and her usual outbursts of anger. When she realized I wouldn't give in, she left. You probably think that's where it ended, and they vacated the house. Far from it. My mother's unlucky husband hadn't entered the fray yet. This stubborn guy left me a voicemail. "Dude, you have no idea who you mess with. I can lift you like a barbell and make you beg for mercy. One punch to the face, and you'll forget about the house. Show up at my door again, and I'll knock you out." This guy is big and loves to brag about it. I know almost nothing about him, but my grandparents warned me not to get involved with him. He's definitely a hooligan, but he's also as dumb as a cork. He provided evidence against himself, threatening me in the voicemail. I didn't respond because I wanted the police to handle it. On the day of the intended eviction, I went to the police station and filed a report about the received threats. I had evidence to back it up. My lawyer went with me and asked the police to escort us during the eviction. When we arrived at the house with my lawyer, my mother, Bill, and Brenda started arguing with us. Her unlucky husband even came out with a hockey stick. But as soon as he saw the police car behind ours, he backed off. The police showed them the eviction notice and demanded that they vacate the house. They were so confident they could chase me away that they didn't even bother packing their things. They asked the police for another month. The officers looked at me, and I said, "That's impossible, not after all those threats." Then they started using Brenda's pregnancy as an excuse to ask for a few more days. But I insisted, "Now!" The police looked at me with some judgment, as if I were being overly insensitive, but I was acting strictly within the law, so no one could say anything against me. They continued to bargain for at least one more day. I replied, 3 hours. They looked at me bitterly. Bill even tried to ram into me with his shoulder, glaring angrily. The police shouted, "Start packing your things!" After that, we all left. The officers told them to bring the keys to the station so I could collect them from there. My lawyer suggested obtaining a restraining order against them regarding this property in case they tried to return and harass me or future tenants. They are fully capable of doing so. I agreed, and the police handed them a copy of the restraining order, explaining the consequences of violating it. The bitterness on their faces was obvious. So finally, I got the house and put it up for rent. I hope to secure a good lease and start my business as soon as possible. Enough dealing with these stubborn people. This is likely my final update unless this family decides to trouble me again. In general, write your opinion. At the expense of this story, you can also share yours in the comments. It will be interesting to read. Don't forget to subscribe and like. Your support is very important to me. Take care of yourself.